Thank you all very much. I'm just going to start with what this is not. Despite the Britney microphone, this is not a musical. I leave that it could go right early. We might be switching microphones earlier than expected. No, I'm a gay woman, so it's going to be about sports, obviously. Okay, we're going to switch it out. Whoops. Sorry, crew. And I really shouldn't stereotype, because not all gay women love sports. There are some gay women here that are like wearing makeup and stuff, so that's different. All right, let's not stereotype. No, this is not going to be a musical, because that got my heart rate racing. Also, where's Joel? Really looking forward to exploring my career as a stockbroker after this. I could definitely feel that. The second thing that this won't be, and for some of you, hopefully this won't disappoint you, this is not going to be a theological talk. Not because I'm not equipped to do that. I am trained to do that. I've written on that. I've got some stuff coming out on that. And there's a couple of us here that are happy to have that conversation in the right space, in the right time, including myself and Joel. We're happy to have that conversation with some of you that are wanting to have a conversation about the theology of LGBT inclusion. But this is not what I'm going to do today. When I started my PhD journey, I was doing it in pastoral theology, and I realised fairly early that there were a bunch of conversations that are happening where people were just basically talking past each other. And so I set aside my doctorate in pastoral theology to go back to my first love of history. I mean, obviously, first love is Jesus. Jesus, Bronte, coffee, history. There we go. And go back and actually look at how did we get here? How did the church get to the situation that we're in at the moment? And so what I want to do today is have a bit of a conversation with you about history, about the stories that we tell. And so that's where we are today. Safina said to us this morning that we need to look back to move forward, that we actually need to understand where we've come from, the stories that have been told, the things that have been done in order to move forward honestly and authentically. And she said without understanding the past, it's actually dangerous to move forward, because we have to know the ground that we're on. And so that's where I'm going to begin with you today. I'm talking about LGBT inclusion in the church, and I'm going to have control of that in a moment. I'm just seizing everything, aren't we? There we go. But I want to talk specifically about trajectories of hope and narratives of inclusion. I want to talk to you this morning, or this afternoon as it is very soon, about why telling a better story in the church is good news for everyone, is gospel at its heart. That's what I want to talk to you about. But I want to start in a place that might seem unusual for some of you, except those of you who heard me talk in the last 12 months when I've told this story before. All right. I'm going to need, yep, there we go. If you were writing a history of Australia, what events should be included in that narrative? This is kind of like the standard history of Australia that I got taught when I was at school. Obviously, Australian history starts with the discovery of Australia with Lieutenant James Cook, as he was at the time, or Captain James Cook, in 1770. And then the next important thing that happens is 1788, when we had the arrival of the First Fleet. There's a couple of other things that are pretty important that happened. Obviously, 1854, we had the Eureka Stockade, which is so important to workers' rights, union movement, all sorts of things, the development of labour politics in Australia. Ned Kelly, you can't have a history of Australia without Ned Kelly. Federation on the 1st of January 1901, that's a big one. And then, of course, John Howard would kill me if I didn't include 1915 Gallipoli landing in a history of Australia. And that's pretty much it, right? That is the big story of, isn't it? Some of you look blank. See, the story that you tell depends on the perspective that you take. And if I look at this story the problem is I have to ask myself, whose story am I telling? Because there's some voices missing from this story. So we'll have a go and we'll do it better. Because obviously the last one was just a story. This isn't going to work, so I'm going to have to combine with you guys. I think if you go out of the screen, I lose control of it. All right, so there we go. Obviously, the last one was just British, so we're going to tell a better story. Here's a better story. It actually starts in 1606 when the Dutch discovered Australia. That's when it really happened, right? So 1606, William Jansen, first European to map the coastline. Now we're rolling. And of course, the Batavia was wrecked on the western coast of Australia. 1999, William Dampier was actually the first Englishman to map the coastline. So that's a better story, right? Because it's not just British. What's the problem with this story? It's very white. We might have included more Europeans, but it's still a very white story. So we'll do it better. All right. We really are not working. Sorry, Brad. All right. Let's do it properly and include my wife's people. 1477, the Chinese actually mapped the coastline of Australia. Finally, we're telling the story properly. Yeah? Are we there yet? Is there anyone I'm missing? What? Oh. She really is going, whoopsie daisy. Now I've got too much control. Sorry, I need to go back one. We're going to switch?
We're going to try and switch.
All right.
What do you reckon?
Beautiful. Hey, Safina, is this a better story? Because actually, our first evidence of the occupation of Australia starts about 65,000 years ago. The first actual archaeological evidence of Aboriginal people in Australia, 63,000 years ago. And then, yes, it's true that in the 1400s, the Chinese charted the coastline. And yes, it's true that the Portuguese charted the coastline in the 1500s and the Dutch in the 1600s. And then we had British invasion and colonisation, because if we're going to tell a better story, we need to call it for what it was and is, not a discovery and not a mere settlement. And we also have to acknowledge the frontier wars that began in the 1780s. But two of the biggest events in terms of the frontier wars in those early days were Pemulwuy's resistance starting in 1792 and the Hawkesbury Massacre in 1794, which led to incredible devastation and massacres going right into the 1820s. We know that those massacres of Indigenous people went at least into the 1930s. One of the last big massacres that we know of was 1928 in Coniston in Central Australia. But we have evidence of those massacres continuing and reprisals continuing into the 1930s. And if we looked at the story honestly, we would look at the situation in terms of statistics of people incarcerated in Australia and health outcomes and all sorts of things and go, actually, that's never finished. Whose story are we telling? Where does Australian history begin? Where does it end? Who is getting a voice in the story that we're telling? Who's silenced in our story? Who's benefiting from the way that we're telling our story? Who is benefiting from the history that we're telling? And who is harmed, thank you, Joel, by the story that we're telling, by the spaces that we create with that story? So the question I want to ask today is the story that we're telling in our churches and our ministries, is that story good news for all people? Is that story good news for all? In Australia, who gets included in the story that we tell about who may belong in Christ? One of my favourite historians, Anna Clark, says each iteration of Australia's national story, we're on to clicker number 3. This is awesome. I hope we're recycling. These aren't single-use plastics, are they? Okay. Anna Clark says, Each iteration of Australia's national story reveals not only the past in question, but the guiding concerns and perceptions of each generation of history makers. And I think that's something we haven't understood in the church. I think we haven't understood that the story that we're telling in our churches today is not just some one line of continuous narrative that we've inherited from the apostles. It's actually informed by the guiding concerns of our society and the guiding concerns of the last 30 to 40 years, 50 years even. But the version of the story that we're telling today is informed by the past and by the guiding concerns of today. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that today. Tonight, I should say, if you hang around. Who gets to be in the story of faith in Australia? Who are we including? Who is missing out? As I started as a religious historian, as I started looking at kind of the big picture histories of religion in Australia, those that were claiming to be telling the big story of Christian faith in Australia, I've started to find a bit of a pattern about the way that we tell our stories. I'm going to tell you more about that in a second, but for now, I want to tell you about the story that I learnt growing up, which was a good story. Because a lot of my kind of theological formation in the churches in which I grew up in the Salvation Army before being ordained in the Pentecostal church, actually. But my kind of theological foundation and formation was in the Salvation Army, and then I did my theological training at an ecumenical evangelical college in Canada called Regent College. But I learnt that the story that we are told in the book of Acts is this incredible story of the increasing embrace of the gospel. That something that starts as this localized phenomenon in a small kind of house environment in Jerusalem gradually expands to the uttermost parts of the earth. I learned that it went from Jerusalem to Judea and Samaria and to the Gentiles, and from the Gentiles to Asia even to the Europeans, like no one could save them. And till it finally reaches Rome, the kind of center of the world at that point in time, as far as it was understood by the Romans. But the story that I was told is of this ever-expanding community that's continually being widened to include those who had not yet been embraced. That's the story that I learned. I learned a story that was based on verses like Luke 19 and Acts 28 and Revelation 7 that talks about people of all ethne, of all nations coming and gathering around the throne of Christ, where all would be welcome and finally all would be one. And yet, there's this funny thing that happened in world missions at some point. And I say this as a former missionary. When I heard people speaking about these verses, there was this focus on all ethne, all people groups, all ethnicities. And that missionaries, the responsibility is to take the gospel to all ethne, right? To all people groups throughout the world. And somehow the embrace of the gospel became racially charged rather than a focus on all humanity. It was this race to get the gospel to all people groups, to all nations, to all ethnicities, so that Christ could return again, so that we could fulfill the Great Commission, that somehow we'd turned racial. And somewhere in the midst of that, you wouldn't believe it, but a particular race was kind of safeguarding that and ensuring that everything would get to the destination and kind of controlling the story. But somewhere in there, we went from an understanding of all humanity to all ethne. And that's good in one way. Like, let's not have a whitewashed gospel. Let's have a gospel that is for all people and of all colors. 100%. And yet, let's not guard certain types of humans from being embraced in the story. What about the inclusion and embrace of all people regardless of social strata? What about the inclusion and embrace of all people regardless of ability or disability? What about accessing our spaces? What about regardless of gender or gender identity? What about regardless of sexuality? Is it still a gospel for all people? As I was doing my research, I ended up coming up with a little bit of a graph to discover, to review, to kind of highlight some of my findings. And before I put this up, I'm just going to tell you, Reviewer 2 hates this graph. Okay, if you're from an academic context, you know what I mean. Reviewer 2 hates this graph. And I will explain why in a moment. But knowing that, I'm going to show you this. What we've got here, hallelujah, we have found the one. What we have here is a graph that shows who gets included in Australian religious histories by binary gender, which is the only category of gender that these books understand. During my PhD journey, I did an analysis of all of the kind of broad-speaking histories of Australia, of Christianity in Australia, that I could find at that time, that I was able to access in the midst of COVID. And I compared in each of those volumes how many people are named. Okay, so how many people are mentioned by name, and then did a comparison by binary gender. And this is what I found. At the very worst, the ratio of men mentioned by name in comparison to women is 1 to 63. The very best, the most recent works that we have, it's a ratio of 1 to 5. And these are in works that are seeking to champion women. And yet, in every one of these works that champion women and are wanting to lift the profile of women, the ratio of men being mentioned by name to women being mentioned by name, at best 1 to 5. You find awesome things like the debate on the ordination of women in the Anglican Church in the late 20th century, where they will list the names of all of the men that were involved in the debate. I can tell you the name of the bishops that were for and against the debate. I can tell you the names of the lawyers that actually took it to court to contest, whether or not women should be ordained and should be allowed to preach in church. And I can tell you the names of the male judges who ruled on them. I could not find in any of these histories the names of the women seeking to be ordained. I finally found the names of 3 women that were named as troublemakers for trying to push that debate forward. One of them was Julia Baird. But each of those histories, when they're talking about the ordination of women, the full inclusion and equality of women in the church, it became a debate between men without ever naming the people involved. Now, you'll be shocked to hear that the same thing happens when we talk about Aboriginal Christianity. Can name all the different men that led missions and the impact of that. The white men that were fighting for the inclusion of Indigenous people, and the white men that were opposed to the full inclusion. It's incredibly difficult to find the name of an Aboriginal Christian or Torres Strait Christian in our Australian religious histories. I'm supposed to be talking to you about LGBTQ inclusion. So why on earth am I showing you this? Because what we have here is a pattern. Why does Reviewer 2 hate this graph? Well, they say each of these volumes has a slightly different focus and you can't compare them to one another. And I say, yep, that's true. Each of these volumes has a slightly different focus, and yet every single one of them is claiming to tell a big story about faith in Australia. And yet every single one of them has a severe case of gender imbalance, which is just embarrassing. It's just terrible. But it's not fair, the critics say. What about all the other books that have been published about women in religion or about Indigenous Christianity? I'm like, yes, excellent question. What about those books? Why do they have to be separate volumes in a separate category? Why can't they make it into your books? Why are your books celebrated as works of breadth and depth when in reality they're works of white men's Christian history? Why can't we just name them for what it is? If you want those to be in a separate category, then be honest about your own. But what does any of this matter, and what has it got to do with queer inclusion in the church? What does any of this really matter? This matters because the stories that we are told and the stories that we tell in our churches get embodied and repeated by other people. They're the stories that get told in pulpits and lecterns and youth groups and classrooms, and they're stories that are heard by teens and kids in our churches. People like little Karen. That's me about 6 years old in my Hallelujah shirt from the Salvos. Yeah. Our church histories are not neutral. Our theologies are not neutral because the same phenomena is happening there. But I want to just talk to you about history today. Our church histories are not neutral. And this story that I've just told you about binary gender is far from being the only way in which we've curated the story of the people of God. It's safe to say that looking for the lost lesbians of religious history is not what I saw myself doing with my life. I am a fourth-generation preacher. I'm the daughter of two people who were in ordained ministry for over 50 years, both my mum and my dad. I preached my first full sermon in church at the age of 15 years old. I've been a youth leader, a chaplain, a pastor, a missionary, and a Bible college lecturer. And despite my youthful good looks, I've actually been in ministry for 30 years. I grew up in the Salvation Army, which is the church of Catherine Booth, the co-founder of that movement. She's the brains trust between many of the values and beliefs of the Salvation Army that have come to define the Salvos. Things like the full equality and inclusion of women and the incontrovertible, indissoluble link between doing justice and proclaiming salvation. You can't tear those things apart. I grew up in the church of General Eva Burrows, who was the international leader of the Salvation Army in the late 80s and early 90s. She's an Australian woman who had been an officer in Rhodesia for many years, what's now called Zimbabwe, where she was a pioneer for the education of women and girls. She was the international leader, like the Pope of the Salvos. It was the church of my mum, Merle, who, as an unmarried officer, led several churches by herself. She too was a senior pastor. And in fact, she was teaching at the Salvation Army Bible College when she met my dad, who came through as a student. Now, the Salvation Army of my youth and today, it's not all roses and egalitarianism, but the reality is I grew up in a church where I was privileged to know women who preached powerfully and served God with their whole heart and soul and mind and strength. That's the story that I got to inhabit. And yet, despite all of that, I spent nearly 30 years battling depression and suicidal ideation at the same time as being lauded for my preaching and my international ministry. At the same time. How the heck does that even happen? Because the reality is, I grew up not believing that I was allowed to exist. It took me nearly 4 decades to believe that I could. Because for all of these powerful women in my faith community, I didn't see anyone like me in the stories of my faith community, you know? People who loved Jesus and preached powerfully and did justice and loved women. And yet, here's the thing. Just because those kind of women didn't appear in the published histories that I read or the sermons that I heard, doesn't mean that they don't exist or didn't exist. It doesn't mean that queer Christian women are somehow a recent phenomenon in our society. Which is how, somehow, in the midst of researching unmarried evangelical women in Australia, I began to stumble across these incredible Christ-like, passionate, world-changing lesbians. You see, it turns out there's a difference between not existing and not making it into the story. But when you're a kid growing up in church, it's the story that you hear that creates your world, tells you what is and can be. Oh, if only there was a story in the Bible about like speaking things into being or something. Anyway, maybe another time. By curating the story of the church such that queer people never make it into the pages of our history, we are squeezing and distorting the history of God's people. And the basic truth is, we're risking lives. Where were the women like me? Where were the women like Sammy? Where were the men like Joel? In the histories that I read and the sermons that I heard. And does it really matter? In 2018, there was a study that came out of the University of Texas that was a correlation between religiosity. There's 3 factors of it, and I've just lost them. Correlation between religiosity, the risk of suicidal ideation, and sexuality. It was a study of over 21,000 students. So it was a massive, massive study of students between the ages of 18 to 30. And what they found in this study is for students that placed a high value on religiosity, who had what we would call a strong personal faith, students with a strong personal faith, there was a 17% decrease in recent suicide attempts or suicidal ideation. Now, I would expect that. There's heaps of studies that would back that up. That finding was no surprise. Religion is good for you, so it seems. Except that this study went further than most, and it brought in that third correlating factor of sexuality. And it turns out that religion is good for you if you're straight. Because the reality is, for those who were gay and lesbian, who had placed a high value on their faith, on their personal religious context, there was not a 17% decrease, but a 38% increase in recent suicide attempts or suicidal ideation. And in fact, if you're a lesbian woman like me, it goes up by 52%. Are you starting to understand why the story that we've told is not actually an inherent good? See, the scary thing is that for some people, going to church is risky behaviour. And Joel talked about that a little bit earlier. Why? Because until now, the histories that have been written and the stories that have been told have told us that we can't belong. And those stories are not theoretical. They get enacted and embodied in our churches. I remember the day when I went to walk into church on a Sunday morning. It was after the plebiscite. And there'd been a discovery in the church, because I was asked and talked openly about it, that I had voted yes in the plebiscite. This is the marriage plebiscite. I voted yes in a more recent referendum too, but that's another story. And so this particular morning, as I came into church, a church where I preached regularly, a church where actually not too long before that, they'd asked me to do a whole day seminar on sexuality. But as I was walking into church this particular morning with this new understanding that Karen voted yes in the plebiscite and thought that it was possible to be both gay and Christian, there were elders waiting for me at the door of the church. And as I came into the church, the elders began to point at me and said, "You see this woman? She has an evil spirit in her." And were proclaiming that as I walked into the church. Because people embody the stories that we tell. They take them in and they believe that to be a faithful Christian, I have to tell Karen that she can't exist in this place because that is what honours Jesus. Because the gospel might be for all ethne, but it's definitely not for all the queers. It's not a theoretical story for me. It turns out that the impact of faith on queer people is actually detrimental. It's not an inherent good in the way that we've told the story so often. But it doesn't have to be that way. We get to tell a better story. And the thing is, the more we dig into our archives, the more we dig into our histories, we discover that we don't have to import the gays and the queers and the trans folk and the non-binary folk. We don't have to somehow retrospectively import them into church and find people that we hope maybe we can stick a Christian label on them. What we actually find is that we've always been in the story of the church. It's just that our stories weren't told. I want to share one story with you this morning. Is that okay? I want to tell you the story of someone who's become one of my heroes. Her name is Constance Duncan. Like many people of that era, she has 3 names and goes by the middle one. It's just like my mum. Constance Duncan. Now, Constance Duncan was a missionary, a welfare worker, an internationalist, a refugee advocate, and an architect of social and political reform, particularly for women and children. She started her career as a student leader and travelling secretary with the Australian Christian Student Movement in the 1920s after graduating with a BA and a Master's from the University of Melbourne. In fact, prior to that, when she was still at uni, during World War I, she raised money for the Red Cross by giving people rides on her motorbike. One of the first women in Australia to own a motorbike. And possibly, that right there is a little hint to what I was going to say. So she started a career working with the Australian Student Christian Movement, and then she went to Japan as a missionary with the YWCA, the Young Women's Christian Association, where she really focused a lot of her efforts on working with young women and girls who were working in factory conditions that were incredibly exploitative and dangerous for them. She realised that there were lives being cost because of the conditions in the factories, and she campaigned for better conditions in those factories and for expanding education to women and girls, particularly in the context of, I've just realised that my watch isn't working, so we're going to have a problem. Oh yeah, we've got a problem. And so she was really focusing on the education of women and girls there. But when she came back to Australia because of an illness of her father, she was one of very few people in Australia that was completely fluent in Japanese and had an understanding of the political and social context of Japan in the 1930s in Australia. So she became one of the most renowned internationalists in Australia and an expert in Asia-Pacific relations in the 1930s in Australia. She was a lifelong member of Canterbury Baptist Church in Victoria. She left a legacy to them in her will, as well as to the Australian Student Christian Movement. And in those interwar years, she worked a lot with the League of Nations Union and the International Peace Movement. She was doing all the grunt work and the speaking for people like, if you know anything about internationalism in Australia, for people like Herbert Brooks and Frederick Eggleston. Later, she worked with Doc Evatt in the founding of the United Nations. She was, in her role with the LNU, frequently and quite literally the only woman with a seat at the table. She was invited into spaces where no other woman could go. Throughout the 30s and 40s and into the 50s, she became very well known through her speaking engagements and her radio programs. She had a regular program on ABC National Radio, particularly the League of Nations Club. And then during and after World War II, she was involved in refugee advocacy. And she had an influential career in various departments of the United Nations. My favourite of that is in 1946 when she was asked to be a part of the United Nations Refugee Relief Association, special mission to Korea as Korea was beginning to fragment. She was actually the only woman who was invited to be a part of that mission. It was initially intended to be just a fact-finding mission in Korea, a survey of conditions, but at the end of that, Duncan was invited to remain in Seoul as the special liaison officer to the American and Russian generals, commanding generals in Korea. She was the liaison between them, getting them to continue to talk. The Sydney Morning Herald reported that she was the first white woman to enter Korea since its liberation after nearly 50 years of Japanese rule. And in fact, they even broke with a very ancient tradition by inviting Constance Duncan to a dinner which normally only men would be invited to. And then her last public role was with the World Council of Churches, to which she was appointed in mid-1955, and she worked there until her retirement. She was also central to the establishment of International House at Melbourne University and policies which began to welcome international students to Australia and then advocated that they actually experience welcome when they got here. She exposed the discrimination and prejudice that international students experienced when they came to Australia and advocated for a better welcome. As you can probably tell, I think that she was a bit of a legend. One other thing about Constance Duncan, this woman who was so completely committed to Christ that she believed it was her responsibility to try to transform the world into a better place. She was also the long-term partner of one of Australia's most famous composers, Margaret Sutherland. They lived together for many years before Duncan had to be hospitalised for dementia, which was something, when you read the letters, that just broke Sutherland's heart. This is an incredible woman who did so much good in Australia in the name of Christ, where we are still reaping the benefits in child and maternal welfare, in the establishment of preschools and kindergartens, in the actual welcome of refugees. We're still reaping the benefits of her work. And I can almost guarantee that unless you've heard me speak before, you hadn't heard of her before today. An Australian Christian historian called Ian Murray says there are other means besides bulldozing and vandalism with which to obliterate history. One is simply for books and records to be laid aside for so long that their very existence has been forgotten. I've told you two stories. I've told you a little bit of my story, a little bit of Constance Duncan's story. We are not the only queer women in the room. We're not the only queer women in Australian Christian history. We're not the only queer women in the history of the church. You see, the story of faith is not a neutral story. And it's not neutral the way that we've told it. History is not a scientific discipline. Heck, science isn't even a scientific discipline. In the sense that we select the information that we highlight. We select the sources that we go to. We select the data that we read. And for far too long, we've simply assumed it's not possible to be gay and Christian. It's not possible to be trans and Christian. It's not possible to be non-binary or bi and Christian. And so we've self-selected data that is cisgender, heterosexual, and said, this is the way of Christ. And everyone that we can point to in the stories that we've told matches that narrative. because we've just assumed that no one else belongs. Until one day, something really uncomfortable happens. And you realize that in the middle of the story that you're telling, wait a minute, one of our pastors is gay? One of our faculty members is gay? That doesn't fit our narrative. But instead of examining the narrative and going, oh, wait a minute, there's gays in our churches. Maybe the love of Jesus is broader than we thought. We go, there's gays in our churches. They don't belong. This is our story. And instead of revisiting the story, instead of looking at the interpretive lens that we've been using in history and theology, it's way easier to just kick out the gays and keep the narrative. But I would suggest to you that if we read Scripture, there's a few people that get kicked out of the story at times, and it turns out they're quite central to the narrative. There's one thing I really love about hanging out on the margins of the church, and it's kind of inspired by Hebrews 13. Let us go to him outside the camp. Kicked out because he was impure. Kicked out because he was hanging out with all the wrong people. Let us go to him outside the camp. You see, an LGBTQIA plus inclusive church is in fact a logical consequence of the gospel of Jesus Christ. It's a logical consequence of its narrative and of its trajectory. And yet, a new narrative, a better story won't just happen. We actually have to go back and look at the stories that we're telling. We have to do something terrifying and say, hey, if we're going to talk about decolonization and Indigenous people in the church, how about we actually let an Indigenous person speak about it? How about if we're going to talk about the full equality of women and maybe possibly thinking that we might revisit Galatians 3:26 and think about believing it, how about we might hand the microphone to a woman or a slave or someone outside of our ethnic boundaries? And how about if we're going to talk about LGBT inclusion in the church, what if you went crazy and handed the microphone to the queers? Because it turns out we've actually been here the whole time. And I won't terrify you by visiting some scriptures where maybe we've had some lenses that have caused us to sanitize a few of the stories in there. History isn't neutral, and full inclusion won't just happen. What is it that we will do to incarnate the full embrace of Jesus? We've lost it again, folks. There we go. It was funny, as I was thinking about this, some of you might know Wayne Bryson. He's an Anglican bishop from Canberra. And he had this on his Facebook wall. He's hanging around in New Zealand at the moment. And he put this up on his Facebook wall. The future can no longer be what is going to happen. It is what are we going to do? Because if we make the future about what is going to happen, if we just leave the trajectory the way that it's been, I can tell you what's going to happen. Because that was nearly me. By the grace of God, I'm still here. The future cannot be what is going to happen if we just let things roll on as they are. The future is what are we going to do about it? Oh, and now I'm going to hand over to Christine. You're like, lunch? I thought we were supposed to be having lunch. We are, I promise you, we're having lunch. I want to finish with a story. when I was a teenager and in my 20s, there was this Christian musician I loved Christian music. I was so committed to Jesus and wanting my whole life to be about Jesus that I only listened to Christian music. I didn't own any of those non-Christian things because they're of the devil, just like the gays. And I only listened to Christian music, but I loved Christian music. And there were so many musicians that I really loved, but there was this one whose music just really captivated me and had a profound impact on my life and helped me articulate my desire to live fully for Jesus and passionately for Jesus and surrender my life to the Lord. And her name was Jennifer Knapp, just this incredible muso. Until there came a time in the early 2000s, late 90s, early 2000s, where she just disappeared. And you could not find her anywhere in Christian circles. Her CDs and all of her music was removed from Koorong and Christian bookstores, so you couldn't actually buy it anymore. It was just, she was nowhere. And I always wondered what happened to her. Until about 10 years later, when I discovered that she had been on a journey. And she had, in fact, eventually come out as a gay woman and married an Australian woman. And she started producing music again. And I reconnected with that music at a time when I was really searching for how can I understand my commitment to Christ and this thing that cannot be named. You can say Voldemort easier than gay Christian, I'm telling you. I can't name that. I cannot imagine that could be me because I love Jesus. And you have to choose between the two. And then I see this woman who's playing this incredible music, expressing both. And sometimes I wonder, what if Jennifer Knapp had been allowed to be fully and authentically human when I was a teenager? How many suicide attempts would that have avoided? How many times might I have been driving home from speaking to 1,000 people at a conference, listening to her music or someone else, and reflecting on the goodness of God instead of trying to stop myself driving off a bridge? I wonder. A couple of years ago, I was speaking at a church, and I shared a bit of my story. And at the end of the night, I'd finished up and I was trying to go to the bathroom, actually. I was on my way to the toilets, and this young woman stopped me. And she was crying so hard she could barely speak. And finally she said to me, "Thank you for everything that you're doing for queer Christians. Because of you, I don't have to spend the next 25 years going through what you've been through. I get to live now." Safina said this morning, with safety and belonging, we can move forward. With safety and belonging, we can move forward. There are many who still need to hear. I want to be part of telling a better story. And I want to thank you for making space for that story.
Thank you, Karen, and thank you, Joel. I feel like we didn't give Joel applause before too, because he went straight